Shangyin, Untitled. Empty promises. You're gone without a trace. The moon sinks past the tower at the fifth watch. I dreamed our final parting, stifled a cry. Scratched out this letter, the ink still damp. The candles half reflected in our kingfisher quilt. The embroidered flowers hold a trace of your perfume. Emperor Wu came to regret the distance to the celestial peak. Our pathways blocked by untold other mountains. Okay, so we continue here with the poems by Li Shangyin. He has a lot of poems dedicated to heptasyllabic style, the heptasyllabic meter. So, what's this poem about? Very quickly, very succinctly. It's a longing for the loved one type of poem. We've talked in many previous sessions about a subgenre which I like to call wakefulness at night. So these are poems where the poetic persona, which can be a man or a woman, is unable to sleep. He or she is awake all through the night. Those poems include a description of the nightly sights, also a description of vain attempts at whiling away the time. And the reason why the poetic persona cannot sleep is because the beloved is far away. Now, this is, as I said, a subgenre that is, pretty old in Chinese poetry. I think it dates back, at the very least, to the late Eastern Han Dynasty, so around 200 BC of our era, probably even earlier. In later periods, it became more symbolic or allegorized. So instead of being what it literally appears to be, a man or a woman lamenting the absent lover, it sometimes became infused with other political meanings. Perhaps the reason for being awake was political. Perhaps the reason the person that was being missed was a friend. Anyway, whatever the case, whatever the context, this is, as I say, a pretty conventional subject matter in Chinese poetry. And this poem fits the bill quite steadily. And I think it's not too dark. I mean, I would say the only moderately dark reference is in the last couplet, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, topic of the poem: melancholy sadness at the beloved one's absence and the suffering and the sleeplessness that this produces. And along the way, we get a description of the objects that are in the sleeping chamber, which are objects that were once shared with the lover and that evoke the lover through metonymy. Okay, let's take a look then, couplet by couplet. First couplet. Empty promises. You're gone without a trace. The moon sinks past the tower at the fifth watch. So usually the first couplet in one of these poems presents us the background or presents us the situation. And this poem begins very quickly in media res with a complaining voice. Empty promises. So the absent person has promised or had promised that he or she would come back in a reasonable amount of time, but they were empty promises. The other person has gone without a trace. And in this sleepless night, the moon is sinking past the tower at the fifth watch. So the fifth watch would have been pretty late at night, in fact, almost dawn, which would indicate that the poetic persona has spent the whole night awake, expecting the return of the beloved, or just incapable of sleeping while thinking of the beloved. And the moon is disappearing, it's sinking under the tower. So the end of the night comes, but not the end of wakefulness and unease. Second couplet. I dreamed our final parting, stifled a cry, scratched out this letter, the ink still damp. So a very common trope, which we've also encountered a lot, is that when you are separated from a loved one and you really love that person, in dreams, your soul abandons your body and goes in the direction of that other person. We don't have exactly that here. We don't have the soul traveling, but we have a tormented episode in some of the few hours of sleep that the poetic persona might have enjoyed. The dream was not a nice one. It was a reminiscence of the time when the poetic persona and the beloved parted. Yeah? So waking up, the poet stifles a cry. He has to repress, he or she has to repress the pent-up emotion, and writes a letter. And the ink is still damp, so the letter was recently written. So it's a letter for the departed one, for the faraway one. And, the Chinese had this very romantic view of literature and of writing, which is that words are produced, or song and poetry are the result of pent-up emotion, which breaks the dams and, just flows out. So, suffering from this dream and from this absence, the poet writes, not a poem, apparently, the poetic persona, but a letter. Third couplet. Now, in the second part of a regulated poem, as I have usually told you before, we generally move from the outer to the inner, from the more objective and descriptive to the more subjective. The following couplet, which is the third couplet, describes the elements in the room. So it's definitely a zoom in. And they are objects that are meant to evoke two things, at least at the same time: the luxurious surroundings in which the poetic persona is, but also at the same time the objects that were connected to the beloved one who is no longer there and evoke painful memories, just as the dream in the previous couplet did. The candles, half reflected in our kingfisher quilt, the embroidered flowers hold a trace of your perfume. So first we have, in this couplet, in the two lines, we have an object which is connected in the caesura, in the second part of the same line, with another object which more closely connects with the beloved and with the shared space, or the shared objects, or the shared memories that connect directly to the absent person. So the candle first. So we have a candle. The candle is half reflected in our kingfisher quilt. So there's a candle. Candles are also used sometimes, as symbols of night and of crying, because of the wax dripping from the burning wick. So this candle, there's a symbol of those things, perhaps, and of a wakeless, a dreamless or a sleepless night. This candle is being reflected. Where does it reflect? On the kingfisher quilt. So the quilt was the place where the lovers would have slept. Kingfisher was made of kingfisher feathers, which are very shiny and bright and colourful, and with a slightly metallic tinge. So they would seem to be reflecting the light of the candle. And the light lands on that shared space, which was the quilt, which in better times the lovers slept under, both together. And then the embroidered flowers hold a trace of your perfume. So I imagine the embroidered flowers are also in the bedroom, perhaps in the curtains surrounding the bed, or in the curtains of a window. So these embroidered flowers, in this case, the image is not visual; it's scented. So, or visual and scented. The embroidered flowers hold a trace of your perfume. You are absent, but still the aroma, the perfume that you used to wear, lingers on in this space and in these embroidered flowers. So you could say that this couplet focuses through objects on the presence of an absence, on the lingering remains, images, scents of the parted person. Finally, the conclusion. The last couplet generally summarizes the rest of the poem and tries to intensify and summarize the pathos, the feeling of the whole poem. In this case, we get the feeling of the poem expressed, but it goes through a slightly indirect detour through a historical anecdote. Emperor Wu came to regret the distance to the celestial peak. Our pathway is blocked by untold other mountains. So this idea that our path is blocked by rivers and mountains, again, is an extremely conventional image in Chinese poetry. I think it's already present in the Book of Odes. And it makes a comeback in tons of traveling poems, or in poems of parting, or in poems of separation, like this one. It's the idea that I really wish we could get together, but the landscape is, is blocking our way. There are too many mountains, too many rivers that need to be crossed. As we know, China was a huge empire. The distances that it had were massive distances that took months of travel and insecurity to take. So, this is a poetic trope, but, it underlies a very real difficulty of the break of contact with relatives, perhaps scholar officials, who might have been at the ends of the empire and who might die there. So the pathway is blocked. We cannot get together. And this is highlighted with, as I said, a historical anecdote. Emperor Wu came to regret the distance to the celestial peak. So I'm not 100% sure of what the reference is. I think this is a reference to Emperor Han Wudi. He was the most powerful emperor of the Han Dynasty, and one of his concubines, one of his most beloved concubines, died, and he lamented her departure, and he used sorcerers and wizards to try to bring her soul back. And some of these sorcerers more or less convinced the emperor that concubine was living now in the islands of the immortals in the extreme east, and managed to bring her shadow and show it to the emperor. So I think that is what is evoked here. Celestial Peak, in the original I've checked, is Peng Shan. So I'm not completely sure, but I think that Peng might be connected with Peng Lai, one of the islands of the immortals in the eastern coast. So that's it. So we have a poem of brooding, of lament, of complaint at separation of the loved persons, whether it be just poetic fancy or really based on a genuine feeling of suffering from being separated from a loved one. We can never know.